Your soul is mine.
Thomas Aldridge thought he knew every inch of the museum, every portrait, every shadow. But lately, the paintings had begun to move. Eyes that followed him, smiles that changed when he blinked, and among them, the face of his long-lost sister. He tried to tell himself it was fatigue, tricks of the light, until the whispers started. Soft, familiar voices calling his name from the dark halls. Now, he can't tell what's real, the art, or the memories. Because sometimes, the faces don't wait for you to look away. Sometimes, they're already watching.
The museum was a cathedral of shadows by night. Each corridor, each gallery, was steeped in a hushed reverence, broken only by the soft echo of Thomas Aldridge's footsteps on the cold marble floor. He moved with the precision of a man accustomed to solitude and routine, a curator whose life was bound to the art that surrounded him. Tonight, as with every night since his appointment weeks ago, Thomas embarked on his nightly rounds, a ritual he found both comforting and necessary. The building exhaled a cool breath that brushed against his skin, the air thick with the scent of aged wood and faint traces of varnish. The lights were dimmed to a pale glow, meant to preserve the paintings but also casting long, restless shadows that danced just beyond the periphery of vision. Thomas' eyes, sharp and practiced, scanned each portrait with a meticulous gaze honed by years of study. At first, the faces seemed frozen in their eternal stillness, stoic visages, captured in oil and canvas, remnants of the past locked behind glass and gilded frames. Yet as Thomas passed the portraits lining the eastern gallery, a peculiar sensation prickled at the back of his neck. Something was off. The eyes of a stern gentleman in a dark frock coat seemed to shimmer momentarily, the corners twitching with a subtle life that should not be possible. Thomas halted, his breath catching in the quiet. He stepped closer, the polished floor creaking faintly beneath his weight. He fixed his gaze on the portrait. The man's lips, pressed into a thin line, quivered just for a heartbeat before settling once more into the painted stillness. Thomas blinked rapidly, questioning the reliability of his senses. Had the flickering lamplight played a trick? Was it a reflection, a fleeting shadow? He reached out instinctively, but the glass was cold and unyielding. A whisper of unease threaded through his mind. He had been alone in the museum for hours before his rounds began, yet the sensation that the portraits were not as inert as they appeared clung stubbornly to his thoughts. He moved on, but every few steps, his eyes returned to the faces around him, searching for confirmation or dismissal of the strange phenomena. Passing a portrait of a woman in a flowing gown, Thomas caught sight of a subtle shift, the tilt of a head, the narrowing of eyes. The painting's expression seemed to flicker between serene and wary, as though the woman herself was aware of his scrutiny. A chill swept through Thomas's spine, and he swallowed hard, forcing himself to focus on the familiar details, the fine brushstrokes, the muted palette, the weight of history held captive in pigment. The silence of the museum felt suddenly heavier, a presence lurking just at the edge of perception. Thomas's footsteps slowed, his pulse quickening. He was alone, or so he thought. Yet the portraits whispered secrets without words, their painted faces alive with subtle, haunting motions that defied explanation. He paused before a cluster of portraits depicting various figures from the city's past: merchants, artists, patrons, each face seemingly alive, shifting imperceptibly in the dim light. Thomas's mind raced. Was this a trick of his imagination brought on by fatigue? Or was something more sinister at work, a force that toyed with reality itself? His hand trembled slightly as he pulled his coat tighter around him. The museum, once a sanctuary of art and memory, now felt like a threshold to something darker. Thomas's curiosity, a steady flame until now, flickered with uncertainty and a growing sense of dread. As he continued his rounds, the faces seemed to watch him more intently, their eyes following his movements with an unnatural focus. The air grew colder, the shadows deeper. Thomas forced himself to breathe steadily, to remind himself that he was a man of reason, grounded in facts and history. Yet, as he reached the museum's grand hall and the last of the portraits, he could not shake the feeling that the art was watching back, waiting. And somewhere within those painted eyes, a secret stirred one that would soon pull Thomas into a nightmarish world where the boundary between the painted and the living would blur beyond recognition. He glanced once more at the portraits before him. In the dim light, a faint smile brushed the lips of a portrait he had passed many times without note. Tonight it was different. The smile was fleeting, almost mocking, and when Thomas blinked, it was gone. Thomas Aldridge swallowed hard and pressed onward, unaware that this small, almost imperceptible movement marked the beginning of a descent that would unravel his sanity and forever change the museum he was sworn to protect. The shadows in the frames had begun to move, and so had the shadows in Thomas's mind. Thomas Aldridge moved silently through the museum's shadowed halls, the faint hum of the overhead lights, the only sound accompanying his measured footsteps. The air was cool, tinged with the musk of aged canvas and varnished wood, a familiar scent that once brought him comfort, but now felt oppressive, like the breath of something unseen pressing close. His eyes were drawn again and again to the portraits that lined the walls of the East Wing. They were faces caught in time painted decades, sometimes centuries ago yet lately. Some of them seemed to breathe with a subtle, disturbing life. At first, Thomas had brushed it off as fatigue or the tricks of dim lighting, but tonight the shifts were undeniable. He halted before a particularly large portrait of a stern-looking man in a dark coat. The face was weathered and stern, but as Thomas gazed, a flicker of movement caught his eye. The mouth twitched, the eyes narrowed, and for a heart-stopping moment, the man's features melted and reformed, softening, smoothing until the figure staring back at Thomas was unmistakably that of Alan Prescott, a boy he had known in school long ago. The recognition sent a cold shiver down his spine. Thomas blinked hard, stepping back to shake the illusion, but as he looked again, the portrait had reverted to its original grim expression. He reached out, his fingertip brushing the glass, a chill spreading from the contact point through his hand. No warmth, only a coldness that seemed to seep upward into his bones. Impossible, he murmured to himself, it can't be real. But the image lingered in his mind, vivid and aching with memory. Alan Prescott had vanished years ago under murky circumstances, a shadow in Thomas's past he had long tried to forget. Why would that face appear here, in this museum? Was it a trick of his mind? The museum's silence preying on his loneliness. He moved to the next portrait, forcing his gaze to remain steady. A woman's face, elegant and serene, but then the lips parted in a subtle, mocking smile. Thomas's heart raced as the features shifted again, this time into someone else, Margaret Ellis, a figure from a painful chapter of his youth. Breathing heavily, Thomas stumbled back toward the exit, his thoughts a whirlwind of disbelief and growing dread. He tried to call out, to find anyone to share what he had seen, but the corridors echoed only with his own footsteps. Later, sitting in his small office cluttered with catalogues and notebooks, Thomas scoured through old photographs and records, searching for a connection, an explanation. The faces from the portraits haunted him, their presence a flickering flame in the dark corners of his memory. He traced the names, the dates, the long-forgotten stories, each revelation tightening the knot of anxiety in his chest. The night deepened. The museum's silence pressed in, broken only by the occasional creak of settling wood or distant drip of water. Thomas's eyes burned with exhaustion as he finally rose to leave, but paused before the bathroom mirror. His reflection stared back, familiar yet somehow altered, as if the shadows beneath his eyes were deeper, the lines more pronounced. He leaned closer, scrutinizing his own face. A flicker, was that a smile too, or merely a trick of the flickering fluorescent light? Thomas recoiled, a cold sweat breaking out across his brow. The faces in the portraits had moved when no one was looking. But what if now they were moving within him? He turned away from the mirror, the quiet dread settling like a stone in his stomach. The night was far from over, and the museum held its secrets close, watching. "What are you trying to show me?" he whispered into the darkness, the question hanging unanswered in the stale air. Outside, the city slumbered, unaware of the shifting faces within the gallery walls, and the man caught between memory and madness. And as Thomas stepped back into the shadows, the portraits waited, their eyes glinting with a secret that would not be silenced. Thomas Aldridge lingered long after the museum's closing hours, the dim glow of the overhead lamps casting elongated shadows across the silent gallery. His eyes were fixed on a single portrait. One had begun to haunt his every thought. The image was of a young woman, pale and ethereal, her gaze both vacant and accusing. It was Mary, his sister, whose absence had carved a hollow ache in his life for years. Tonight, as every night, he studied the subtle distortions that flickered across her painted face. The faintest twitch of a mouth, a glimmer of moisture in the eyes. Movements so slight and fleeting that any casual observer would dismiss them as tricks of light or the wear of aging varnish. But to Thomas they were unmistakably alive. He stepped closer, the worn wooden floor creaking beneath his careful steps. The air was thick with the scent of old oil paint and dust, a scent that seemed to seep into his skin, drawing out memories he'd long tried to bury. Memories of laughter and screams, of whispered arguments and cold silences, of a fractured family torn apart by unspoken truths. His fingers itched to reach out, to touch the canvas, but he dared not. Something about the portrait felt wrong, charged with a presence that was both familiar and alien. Retreating to his office, a cramped room lined with books and files, Thomas sank into his chair, the silence pressing against his temples. He pulled from a battered drawer a stack of faded photographs and yellowed letters, relics from a past he rarely allowed himself to revisit. His hands trembled as he sifted through them, each image a shard of broken memory. There was Mary, smiling in a sunlit garden, her eyes bright with life. And there a letter, fragile and creased, its ink smeared from years of tears. The words spoke of distance and regret, of promises unkept and pain endured in silence. The past clawed its way into the present, entwining with the eerie phenomena unfolding within the museum's walls. Thomas's nights grew restless, haunted not just by the shifting faces in the portraits, but by the ghosts of his own making. His colleagues noticed the change, the drawn lines under his eyes, the distracted way he moved through the halls, the way he flinched at shadows no one else saw. Yet when questioned, he offered only curt replies, retreating further into himself. One afternoon, as he passed through the staff corridor, a tentative voice called after him. "Thomas, are you all right?" It was a fellow curator, concern etched in her features. Thomas stopped, forcing a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Just tired," he said, his voice low and tight. Without waiting for a reply, he walked on, the distance between them widening with every step. Outside, the city was a muted blur, the usual cacophony softened by the early evening mist. Thomas wandered aimlessly, the cold bite of the air sharpening his senses, but doing little to ease the ache within. The streets were empty, the glow of street lamps casting pools of light that flickered like the faces in his mind. Lost in thought, he barely noticed the world around him, trapped in a spiral of memories and fear. Back inside the museum, the portraits seemed to watch him, their eyes shifting with secrets too terrible to voice. The transformation of Mary's image was no longer subtle. The once faint movements now held a sinister clarity. Her painted lips parted as if to speak, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Thomas knew with a chilling certainty that the past was not done with him. The faces that moved when no one was looking were beckoning him deeper into the darkness of memory and madness. As the shadows lengthened and the gallery grew cold, Thomas felt the first real tremors of his unraveling self. His reflection in the glass of the portraits was a stranger's hollow, haunted and uncertain. And yet, despite the dread that clung to him like a second skin, he could not look away. The echoes of memory called him onward, promising answers at the cost of his very soul. The night stretched on, and with it, the faces continued their silent, spectral dance. Thomas knew that soon the fragile boundary between who he was and what the portraits revealed would shatter entirely. And when that night came, there would be no turning back. The night had settled over the museum like a thick, suffocating veil, the kind that pressed on the skin and whispered secrets only the walls had ever heard. Thomas Aldridge was already deep into his nightly rounds, the dim glow of the aged sconces casting long shadows that danced along the marble floors and ornate moldings. His footsteps were nearly silent, muffled by the plush carpet runner that stretched along the main hall. He moved with a careful deliberation, as if any sudden motion might disturb the fragile stillness he so desperately clung to. Yet tonight was different. As Thomas stopped before the row of portraits that lined the East Gallery, an unshackable tension gripped him. His eyes scanned the faces, searching for what had eluded him these past few nights. The subtle, almost imperceptible shifts, a twitch of a mouth, a flicker of the eyes had grown more distinct. But now, as he stared, the faces seemed to ripple with a terrible life of their own. His breath caught when he recognized the familiar contours of one visage, a face from a memory he had tried to bury deep, far beyond the reach of daylight. Thomas. The voice was soft but urgent, pulling him back from the edge of his spiraling thoughts. He turned slowly, eyes meeting the concerned gaze of Elena Marsh, the assistant curator. She stood at the threshold of the gallery, her dark hair pulled back in a loose knot, practical attire suited to her no-nonsense demeanor. "Elena," he said, voice hoarse with disuse. "I didn't hear you come in." She stepped closer, her brow furrowed as she scanned his pale face. "You look like you've seen a ghost." He offered a faint, humorless smile. "In a way, I have." Elena glanced at the portraits behind him, then back to Thomas. "You mean the faces?" He nodded, swallowing hard. "They're changing." The faces. It started as small things, a blink, a twitch, but now it's more. They shift, sometimes into people I know, people I thought I'd left behind. She sighed, a mixture of skepticism and genuine concern crossing her features. "Thomas, you've been under a lot of pressure lately. Long hours, the new responsibilities. Maybe you're just tired." He shook his head emphatically. "No, it's more than that. You have to see it for yourself." Reluctantly, Elena allowed herself to be led to the gallery. The air was thick with the scent of old varnish and dust, the kind of smell that clung to the bones of a building that had witnessed generations. Thomas stood before the same portrait, his finger trembling as he traced the outline of the painted face. "Look," he whispered. Elena's eyes narrowed as she leaned in, scrutinizing the canvas. For a moment, it seemed simply the work of the artist, a somber, dignified woman in muted tones. But then, a subtle flicker, a tightening of the lips, a glimmer in the eyes caught her attention. That can't be right," she murmured. "Is this some kind of trick of the light?" Thomas exhaled slowly. "I thought so at first, but it's more than light. It's as if the painting is alive." Elena stepped back, crossing her arms. "Alive? Paintings don't move, Thomas." "Tell that to my mind," he replied, his voice edged with desperation. "I'm not losing my grip, Elena, but something is wrong here, something terrible." She searched his face, seeing the raw fear beneath his composed exterior. "All right," she said finally. "I'll help you look into this, but we need to be careful. If this is some kind of stress-induced hallucination, we need to get you the help you need." Thomas's eyes flickered with gratitude. "Thank you. I don't know how much longer I can hold on to reason." For a moment, silence settled between them, broken only by the faint ticking of the old grandfather clock in the far corner. The museum seemed to breathe around them, the portraits watching with eyes that knew too much. As they moved together through the galleries, Elena's presence was a balm to Thomas's fraying nerves. She asked questions, noted oddities, and offered practical suggestions that anchored him to the tangible world. Yet, as much as she tried to dismiss the supernatural, Even she could not ignore the subtle shifts, the way shadows lengthened unnaturally, or how the eyes in a portrait seemed to follow their movements with a sentient gaze. Later, in the curator's office, the atmosphere was thick with unease. Elena poured 2 cups of tea, the steam curling in delicate spirals as it rose into the stale air. She handed one to Thomas, who took it with a shaky hand. "You need rest," she said gently. "Whatever this is, it's feeding on your fear. You can't fight it alone." Thomas nodded, the weight of his solitude momentarily lifted by her kindness. "I'm scared, Elena. Not just for myself, but for the people these portraits show. I don't know what's happening to them or to me." She met his gaze steadily. "Then we'll face it together." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending a chill through the old building. Somewhere in the distance, the faintest whisper of movement stirred the gallery, as if the faces themselves were listening. The night was far from over, and the shadows held secrets that neither of them were ready to face. As Thomas sat back, the edges of his vision blurred, and the faintest flicker in the corner of the room caught his eye, a subtle, almost imperceptible movement in the portrait of a woman he once knew. His heart pounded in his chest, a cold dread settling deep within his bones. Elena noticed the change in his expression and leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "What is it?" He swallowed hard, struggling to steady his breath. "It's her." And with that, the fragile thread of reality they clung to began to unravel anew. The air in the museum was thick with a silence that felt unnatural, broken only by the faint hum of the overhead lights and the soft ticking of the old grandfather clock near the entrance. Thomas Aldridge moved carefully through the dim corridors, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet that had seen decades of visitors, though none at this late hour. His gaze was fixed on the rows of portraits that lined the walls, each frame a silent sentinel holding memories he was beginning to question. He paused in front of one particular painting, Mary Aldridge, his sister. The portrait had always been a quiet presence in the gallery, her serene expression a stark contrast to the turmoil Thomas carried within. But tonight, something was different. He felt it before he saw it, a subtle shift, a tremor beneath the surface of the painted face. At first, the change was nearly imperceptible, the faintest flicker of movement in her eyes, as if the painted gaze had caught a spark of life. Thomas leaned closer, the harsh fluorescent light casting sharp shadows that danced across the canvas. Then, the expression began to alter. The tight-lipped calm gave way to a shadow of pain, the corners of her mouth trembling, as if she were on the verge of silent tears. Her eyes, once steady and distant, now glistened with an impossible moisture, reflecting a sorrow Thomas had long buried. He staggered back, heart pounding with a mixture of disbelief and dread. "No," he whispered, fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold frame. "This can't be." The museum around him seemed to hold its breath. The portraits on the opposite wall remained motionless, their faces frozen in time. But Mary's was alive, not just in memory but in something far more sinister and inexplicable. The following morning, Thomas was a man transformed. The skepticism that had tethered him to reason was unraveling with every passing moment. He sought out Elena Marsh in the curator's office, the familiar hum of the computer, and the faint smell of old paper grounding him just enough to speak. "Elena," he began, voice low and strained, "you have to see this. The portrait of my sister, it changed last night, not just subtly, but emotionally." It was as if she was alive, suffering. Elena looked up from her notes, concern knitting her brow. "Thomas, you re-exhausted. Maybe you re-just seeing things in the shadows. The mind plays tricks when we re-under stress." He shook his head, frustration creeping in. "No, it's different. I've never felt anything like this before. It's like the painting is speaking to me." She hesitated, then stood. "All right, let's take another look together." That evening, they returned to the gallery, the fading light casting long shadows that seemed to creep along the walls. Thomas led her to Mary's portrait, his breath catching as he pointed to the subtle changes, the quiver of the lips, the moist shimmer in the eyes. Elena studied the painting, her scientific mind racing to find a rational explanation. "It's impossible," she murmured, "but I can't deny what I'm seeing." Over the next days, Thomas's nights were consumed by restless vigils in the museum. He paced the galleries, eyes darting from one portrait to another, searching for any sign of movement. The silence pressed against him like a living weight, each creak of the floorboards and distant echo fueling his growing paranoia. The portraits seemed to whisper secrets he was not meant to hear, their faces twisting into masks of sorrow, fear, and regret. Yet Mary's portrait remained the most vivid and haunting, a mirror to his own fractured memories and guilt. One night, driven by a compulsion he could neither understand nor resist, Thomas reached out to touch the glass over her portrait. His fingertips met the cold surface, but beneath the glass, he felt an unexpected warmth, a pulse, fragile yet undeniable. The warmth spread like a slow fire, searing through his skin and into his soul. He jerked his hand back, breath ragged, heart thundering in his chest. The boundary between the painted world and reality seemed to blur, leaving Thomas suspended in a terrifying liminal space where memories and nightmares collided. The museum had become a labyrinth of shifting faces and haunted memories, and Thomas was its unwilling prisoner, drawn ever deeper into a mystery that threatened to consume his very identity. As dawn crept through the stained glass windows, Thomas stood alone before Mary's portrait once more, the weight of the unseen eyes pressing down on him. The first confrontation with the living art had shattered his fragile disbelief, leaving him poised on the edge of obsession. "What are you trying to tell me?" he whispered into the quiet, the words swallowed by shadows that seemed to move just beyond the edge of his vision. And somewhere in the depths of the gallery, the faces shifted again, watching, waiting. The night had settled over the museum like a heavy shroud, silence thick and oppressive in the vaulted halls and shadowed galleries where the portraits hung. Thomas Aldridge moved with his usual cautious precision, feet whispering against polished floors as he made his rounds. Yet, tonight, the familiar surroundings seemed less steady, the air heavier, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Earlier that evening, Henry Blake, the museum's security guard, had reported unsettling disturbances during his patrol. Thomas had already heard whispers of Henry's unease from the staff, but nothing concrete until Henry himself sought him out.
Today.
"Aldridge," Henry began, his voice low and edged with a nervous tremor, as they stood near the museum entrance. "Something's not right. I heard footsteps echoing down the east wing, but when I checked, no one was there, and shadows moving where they shouldn't be." Thomas frowned, his brow furrowing. "Are you certain, Henry? Perhaps the old building's settling or the wind playing tricks." Henry shook his head, eyes darting nervously towards the darkened corridors. "No, sir. This was different, it felt. Wrong. Like the place was alive in some way." Despite his own mounting doubts, Thomas tried to dismiss the feeling, attributing it to the stress of recent nights. He promised to keep watch, but inside an unsettled knot grew tighter in his chest. The following day, Thomas approached Simon Gray in his office. The director sat behind a large mahogany desk, his posture rigid, a stern expression carved into his features. "Simon," Thomas began carefully, "Henry's reports from last night, footsteps, shadows. I think something's happening in the museum after hours." Simon looked up, eyes narrowing slightly. "Thomas, I appreciate your dedication, but we can't afford to entertain ghost stories. Henry's probably seeing things after too many late shifts. Focus on the exhibits and leave the specters to fiction." Thomas felt a surge of frustration but kept his tone measured. "I understand, but if there's something more there isn't," Simon cut in sharply. "We have a reputation to uphold. Let's keep the museum a place of art, not superstition." The dismissal stung harsher than Thomas expected. Simon's words echoed in his mind as he left the office, the gulf between belief and skepticism yawning wider. Later that evening, Thomas returned alone to the East Wing. The dim glow of the emergency lights cast elongated shadows across the walls, and the portraits seemed to watch him silently. Each face, once a static image, now felt charged with a hidden energy, the faintest quiver at the corners of painted eyes. A sudden noise, a faint scraping sound, made Thomas freeze. His breath quickened as he scanned the corridor, heart pounding in the oppressive quiet. The sound ceased, leaving only the heavy silence. Meanwhile, Henry Blake resumed his patrol, flashlight in hand, moving cautiously down a narrow hallway. The beam flickered across peeling paint and faded wallpaper, then caught a flicker of movement just beyond a doorway. He stopped, breath held, muscles tense. "Hello," Henry called softly, voice barely above a whisper. No response. The shadows seemed to pulse, creeping closer at the edges of his vision. He swallowed hard, gripping the flashlight tighter. Back in the gallery, Thomas's isolation deepened. The lack of support gnawed at him, and the growing strangeness of the museum's nocturnal life unearthed shadows within himself. The faces in the portraits no longer seemed merely painted. They were watching, waiting, shifting in ways that defied explanation. As the night stretched on, the museum's silence was broken only by the occasional creak of settling wood and the distant echo of footsteps that belonged to no one. Thomas knew he was slipping further from certainty. The shadows at the edge of his vision were no longer figments, they were warnings. And the museum, once a sanctuary of art and history, was becoming a labyrinth of dread and isolation. He resolved to delve deeper, even if it meant confronting the darkness alone. For the faces in the frames were no longer just art, they were echoes of a truth that would not remain silent. The air in the museum's archive room hung thick with dust and silence as Thomas Aldridge pulled open the heavy oak door. The faint glow of a single overhead lamp cast long shadows over rows of ancient shelves, where forgotten histories slumbered beneath layers of neglect. His breath came slow and measured, part ritual, part necessity, as he stepped inside alone, clutching a small flashlight and a notebook. Tonight, the portraits had shifted again, their faces whispering secrets in the half-light, and Thomas felt compelled to search deeper than ever before. His fingers traced the spines of countless tomes and ledgers, each a repository of the museum's storied past. Then, tucked behind a row of dusty volumes, he found it, a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and worn, embossed with faint symbols that seemed to writhe beneath the lamp's feeble glow. The air grew colder as he lifted it free, a subtle chill crawling along his skin. Settling at a creaky wooden table, Thomas hesitated for a moment before opening the journal. The pages were brittle, yellowed with age, and covered in dense, flowing handwriting punctuated with unsettling sketches, faces twisted in anguish, shadowy figures lurking at the edges. Each entry seemed to pulse with a dark energy, a record not only of the museum's history, but of something far more sinister. As he read, the words revealed a tale of obsession and tragedy, an ancient presence that had haunted the museum for centuries, feeding on the memories sealed within its artworks. The journal's author, a long-forgotten curator, wrote of faces that moved, eyes that followed, and a creeping corruption that twisted the very essence of identity. Thomas' pulse quickened. The descriptions mirrored his own recent experiences with chilling accuracy. A soft creak interrupted his reverie. Elena Marsh appeared in the doorway, concern etched across her face. "Thomas, I thought I heard you down here." She stepped inside, her gaze falling on the open journal. "What have you found?" He looked up, the weight of the discovery pressing down on him. "Something old, something dark, this journal. It speaks of a force tied to the portraits, one that consumes memories and warps reality. I think it's what's been changing the faces." His voice was low, edged with disbelief and fear. Elena drew closer, her eyes scanning the pages. "If this is true, it explains the unrest we both sensed. But it also means we're dealing with something beyond mere superstition." Her tone was pragmatic, yet touched with empathy, a steady anchor for Thomas's unraveling mind. Together, they pored over the journal's passages. Each entry deepened the mystery, accounts of previous curators driven to madness, inexplicable disappearances, and rituals meant to contain the malevolent force. The final pages were scrawled hastily, the ink smeared as if written in haste or fear, warning of a corrupting presence that thrived on human suffering and forgotten sins. A sudden gust of cold air swept through the room, scattering loose papers and causing the shadows to lengthen ominously. Thomas and Alina exchanged a wary glance, the oppressive atmosphere a tangible reminder of the danger lurking within the museum's walls. "We need to understand this fully," Alina said firmly. "If this presence is real, if it's feeding on memories like the journal suggests, then we're running out of time." Thomas nodded, the weight of responsibility settling heavily on his shoulders. The journal had opened a door, one that revealed the true horror behind the shifting faces. Now, armed with knowledge, he faced a choice: to succumb to the creeping madness or to fight for the fragments of identity slipping through his grasp. As they carefully closed the journal and prepared to delve deeper into the museum's secrets, the portraits outside seemed to watch, their faces flickering with unspoken menace. The corrupting presence was stirring, and the battle for control over memory and self had only just begun. The shadows in the archive deepened, and Thomas felt the first icy tendrils of dread curl around his heart. What lay ahead was uncertain, but retreat was no longer an option. The yellowed pages of the journal crackled faintly as Thomas Aldridge turned them under the dim light of the museum's archive room. The air was thick with dust, and the faint scent of old paper smelled both comforting and suffocating. Outside, the oppressive silence of the museum pressed in, broken only by the occasional distant echo of footsteps in empty halls. Thomas' eyes darted across the faded script, piecing together fragments of a history long buried, one that twisted and darkened the very essence of this place. He read a passage describing the origins of the portraits, how each was rumored to be imbued with the memories and secrets of those who had once walked these halls. The words hinted at a malevolent force, something ancient and hungry, feeding not just on the art, but on the hidden sins and forgotten pains held within the painted faces. As Thomas absorbed the grim narrative, a cold shiver traced his spine. Returning to the gallery, the portraits awaited him, hanging in their silent vigil. Yet tonight they were not silent. Subtle shifts flickered across the canvas's, eyes glistening with tears, lips curling in whispers of accusation, faces contorting with anguish and fury. It was as if the paintings breathed, exhaling the dark memories trapped within their frames. Thomas' breath hitched as he approached a portrait of a woman he barely recognized. Her painted gaze shifted, wetness pooling in the corners of eyes that seemed all too real. A faint murmur rose, barely audible, threading through the quiet a whispered lament that clawed at his mind. He staggered back, clutching the journal tighter, the weight of the past pressing down like a physical force. The oppressive atmosphere thickened, the air growing colder as shadows lengthened and danced along the walls. Faces in the portraits twisted further, masks of guilt and fury reflecting not just the subjects, but Thomas' own fractured psyche. Doubt and fear gnawed at him, unraveling the carefully constructed walls of reason he had built around himself. In the midst of his spiraling despair, a light touch grounded him. Elena Marsh's steady hand on his arm was a lifeline, her dark eyes searching his with concern and quiet resolve. "Thomas," she whispered, voice firm yet gentle, "we were going to get through this." Her presence offered a fragile hope, a tether to reality amid the encroaching nightmare. Yet Thomas knew the shadows lurking within the portraits were more than mere illusions. They were harbingers of a darkness seeking to consume not just the museum, but the very essence of his identity. As the night deepened, Thomas felt the boundaries blur between past and present, memory and nightmare, art and life. The portraits no longer merely looked back at him, they reached into him, unraveling the threads of his sanity with each flicker and shift. The museum was alive with secrets, and he was trapped within its haunted heart. The journal's revelations weighed heavy on Thomas' mind, each page turning like a step further down a spiral staircase into madness. He knew that understanding the curse was only the beginning. To save himself and those reflected in the portraits, he would have to confront the darkness head-on, risking everything that remained of his fractured self. Yet as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, the faces in the portraits settled once more into their painted stillness, hiding the horrors that moved when no one was looking. Thomas stood alone, caught between the haunting truths of the past and the harrowing unknown of what was yet to come. And somewhere in the silence, a whisper lingered, a promise of deeper shadows yet to be unveiled. The cold fluorescent lights of the director's office cast harsh shadows across the polished mahogany desk where Simon Gray sat, his fingers steepled as he regarded Thomas Aldridge with a mixture of impatience and thinly veiled concern. The walls, adorned with gold-framed certificates and photographs of past exhibitions, seemed to close in, suffocating the room in an atmosphere of authority and stale tradition. Thomas shifted uncomfortably in the chair opposite Simon, the weight of the director's gaze pressing down on him like the heavy drapery that hung from the windows. The air was thick with unspoken tension as Simon finally spoke, his voice low but cutting. "Thomas, this obsession of yours with these changes in the portraits," Simon began, his tone dismissive. "It's becoming a liability. We have a reputation to maintain. Visitors expect art, history, not ghost stories." Thomas's fingers clenched into fists on his lap, the frustration bubbling beneath his calm exterior threatening to spill over. "I'm not chasing ghost stories, Simon. There's something happening here, something real. The faces, they're removing, changing. It's not imagination." Simon's eyes narrowed, the robustness of his frame leaning forward, his voice taking on an edge of command. "And yet no one else sees it. No one else is reporting disturbances. You're letting your personal fears cloud your judgment. You need to focus on your duties, not these fantasies." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. Years of emotional repression and isolation surged up, fueled by the dismissal of his very experiences. He felt the walls of the museum closing in, the portraits in his mind's eye shifting into faces he recognized, faces from a past he had tried so hard to forget. "You don't understand," Thomas whispered, his voice cracking. "These portraits, they reconnected to me, to my past, to Mary." Simon's expression hardened. "I understand perfectly well that you, allowing yourself to be consumed by whatever demons you wrestling with. But this ends now, or your position here does." The ultimatum hung heavy in the air. Thomas's breath came faster, his mind racing through memories fractured, distorted fragments of his childhood, of his sister's absence. The guilt and the silence that had defined his life. The museum, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison. He left the office abruptly, the echo of his footsteps swallowed by the cavernous gallery. The portraits loomed around him, their faces flickering in the dim light, shifting subtly as if mocking his desperation. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint creak of the wooden floor beneath his feet. Alone, Thomas's thoughts spiraled. The museum's walls seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, the corrupting presence tightening its grip. He could almost hear the whispered voices of forgotten memories, calling to him from the painted faces. Later, in the staff lounge, Elena Marsh watched Thomas with growing concern. She had noticed his withdrawal, the obsessive glances toward the portraits, the restless nights evident in the dark circles beneath his eyes. "Thomas," she said gently, approaching him as he paced the room, "you can't carry this burden alone. Whatever is happening, we need to face it together." He stopped and looked at her, the torment in his eyes laid bare. "They don't believe me, Elena. Simon thinks I'm losing it. But I can't stop. Not now." Her expression was a mix of empathy and pragmatism. "Then let's find a way to prove it. We'll look into the archives, the history of the museum, anything that might explain this. You're not alone." Her words offered a fragile thread of hope, but the shadows of doubt and fear lingered. Thomas knew the path ahead was perilous, the line between reality and nightmare thinning with each passing night. In the quiet solitude of his office later that evening, Thomas sat before a portrait that had recently begun to shift its eyes, reflecting not just the painted subject but something deeper, something anguished and familiar. Outside, the rain tapped a relentless rhythm against the window pane, mirroring the turmoil within. He traced the frame with a trembling hand, the cold glass offering no comfort. The museum was changing, as was he. The corrupting presence was no longer content to remain hidden, and Thomas's fight for clarity and control had only just begun. The night stretched out before him, thick with unease and the whispers of faces that moved when no one was looking. And as the darkness deepened, so too did the question, how much of himself was Thomas willing to lose to uncover the truth? The answer awaited in the shifting shadows of the portraits, and in the depths of his own fractured memories. The flickering flame of a lone desk lamp struggled against the invading darkness of the archive room, casting long, trembling shadows that danced upon the walls stacked high with brittle volumes and forgotten manuscripts. Elena Marsh sat amid the clutter, the weight of the museum's history pressing down on her, yet her resolve was unwavering. Her fingers trembled slightly as she turned the fragile pages of a ledger, the yellowed paper crackling softly in the stillness. Each line of faded ink whispered secrets long buried beneath layers of dust and time. For hours, Elena had immersed herself in the museum's archives, driven by a growing urgency to understand the creeping malaise that had gripped Thomas and the unsettling phenomena unfolding among the portraits. The once orderly museum now felt like a labyrinth of shadows and half-remembered nightmares. Yet here, amidst the quiet rustle of papers and the faint scent of old leather, she hoped to find a thread, a fragile lifeline to pull them back from the edge. Her eyes traced a series of entries referencing acquisitions made decades ago, each accompanied by brief annotations in a precise, looping script. One name reoccurred with unnerving frequency: Mary Aldridge. Elena's breath caught. Thomas's sister, the ghost at the heart of his fractured past, seemed inexplicably entwined with the museum's darkest secrets. She cross-referenced the ledger with a cache of black and white photographs stored in a battered box nearby. Among the portraits, a faded image of a young woman bore an uncanny resemblance to the shifting face Thomas had described. Suddenly, the heavy door creaked open. Thomas appeared in the doorway, his slender frame silhouetted against the dim corridor light. His pale face was etched with exhaustion, yet a spark of something almost like hope gleamed in his eyes. He stepped inside quietly, as if unwilling to disturb the fragile concentration Elena had summoned. "Elena," he whispered, voice rough with fatigue and unspoken fear. "Have you found anything?" She looked up, meeting his gaze with a mixture of sympathy and determination. "There's more to these portraits than we thought. They were tied to tragic events involving your family, Thomas. Especially Mary." Thomas's heart pounded, a cold shiver running down his spine. "What kind of events?" Elena reached into the box and carefully extracted a photograph, presenting it with reverence. The image showed Mary as a young woman, standing beside a portrait that was now infamous in the museum's collection. The resemblance was undeniable, not just in appearance but in the subtle, almost imperceptible expression that had haunted Thomas's nightmares. "Look closely," Elena urged. The portrait's eyes, they shift, reflecting not only the person depicted, but their pain, their memories. It's as if the art itself has absorbed their suffering. Thomas swallowed hard, struggling to reconcile the evidence before him with the growing terror that had gripped his soul. So the portraits aren't just changing faces. They're consuming memories, feeding on the past. Elena nodded slowly. And it's not random. The museum holds more than art, it holds echoes of trauma, of loss. This presence, whatever it is, it's rooted here, fueled by these stories. The room seemed to close in around them, the air thick with the weight of revelation. Thomas's mind reeled, caught between disbelief and a dawning understanding. The museum was a vessel of memories, some beautiful, others corrosive, and the portraits were its living testament. "We have to do something," Thomas said, voice trembling but resolute. "Before it's too late." Elena's eyes met his, steady and resolute. "We will. But first, we need to know everything." Together, they returned to the fragile documents, piecing together a history that blurred the lines between fact and nightmare. Outside, the corridors lay in oppressive silence, the portraits watching with eyes that seemed to gleam in the shadows, their faces still shifting subtly when no one was looking. And somewhere beneath the surface, the corrupting presence stirred, sensing that its hold was being challenged, a dark force that fed on fear, memory, and the fragile boundaries of identity. For Thomas and Elena, the path ahead was uncertain and fraught with peril. Yet amid the encroaching darkness, a fragile hope flickered, the hope of reclaiming lost memories, and perhaps lost souls. The museum was cloaked in its usual cloak of dim shadows and hushed silence, the faint hum of the old building settling into the night. Thomas Aldridge moved carefully through the gallery, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet beneath him. His eyes, sharp and restless, flicked from frame to frame, scanning each portrait with an intensity born of sleepless nights and growing dread. The faces hung in their gilded prisons, still and serene, or so it seemed. Tonight, however, the atmosphere felt different. A subtle electric charge seemed to ripple through the air, as if the walls themselves held their breath. Thomas's pulse quickened. He paused before a portrait of a woman he barely recognized, her features blurred with age, but hauntingly familiar. The faintest shimmer caught his eye, a twitch in the corner of her mouth, a flicker of movement behind those painted eyes. He blinked, shaking off the sensation. It had to be his imagination. Behind him, soft footsteps echoed. Elena Marsh appeared in the doorway, her expression tight with concern. "Thomas, are you sure you shouldn't take a break? You look exhausted." Her voice was gentle but firm, a steady anchor in the growing storm of his nerves. He forced a wary smile. "I can't stop now. Something's happening." The portraits, they rechanging. Elena stepped closer, her eyes scanning the gallery with him. For a moment, the silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Then, without warning, the woman's painted eyes snapped open. A sharp intake of breath escaped Thomas's lips. The air around them seemed to thicken, the temperature plunging. Suddenly, a hand-painted but horrifyingly real lunged out from the frame. The glass shattered with a violent crash, shards scattering across the floor like deadly rain. Elena screamed, stumbling back against the wall, while Thomas dove aside, narrowly avoiding the grasping fingers that clawed at empty air where he'd stood moments before. "We have to get out!" Thomas shouted, adrenaline surging through his veins. But the museum seemed to have transformed into a labyrinth of living nightmares. The portraits surrounding them twisted subtly, their faces melting and reforming into grotesque visages. Shadows lengthened and writhed on the walls, whispering secrets in voices barely audible but unmistakably sinister. Elena gripped Thomas's arm, pulling him toward the exit. Their footsteps rang out sharply in the cavernous space, every echo a reminder of the danger lurking just beyond sight. Behind them, the shattered frame seethed with dark energy, its edges bleeding into the walls like ink spilled on fragile parchment. As they burst through the heavy doors into the chill night air, both gasped for breath. The museum stood silent once more, its windows reflecting the moonlight. Yet through the glass, Thomas caught a glimpse of the portraits inside, their faces twisting into silent screams, a macabre dance of torment trapped forever in paint and shadow. "It's worse than I thought," he whispered, voice trembling. Elena nodded, her eyes wide but resolute. "We need to understand what we're dealing with before it's too late." But even as they spoke, a cold certainty settled in Thomas's chest. The corrupting presence that haunted the museum was no mere figment of his imagination. It was alive, hungry, and growing stronger with every passing night. And the portraits, those cursed faces, were no longer confined to their frames. Tonight, they had awakened. The echo of glass breaking still rang in Thomas's ears as he and Elena disappeared into the darkness, their minds racing with the terrifying possibilities that awaited them. The battle for the museum and for Thomas's very soul had begun. The air in the museum had grown heavier, as if the very walls exhaled a suffocating breath that pressed down on Thomas Aldridge's chest. He found himself rooted in the curator's office, that cramped sanctuary lined with dusty ledgers and faded photographs. Yet it offered no refuge. The portraits, once silent and static, now seemed to pulse with a sinister life, their faces subtly shifting like shadows caught in a flickering flame. His eyes, once sharp and discerning, now darted anxiously from one warped visage to another, seeking meaning amid the fluid distortions. A portrait of his sister Mary hung crookedly on the far wall, her painted eyes glistening with an unnatural moisture. Thomas's gaze fixed on her, the edges of her smile curling into a cruel sneer that vanished the moment he blinked. His hands trembled, fingers curling into fists that pressed against the worn armrest of his chair. The whispers began then soft, indistinct murmurs that slithered through the silence like a gathering storm. He strained to catch the words, but they dissolved into a maddening hum, a chorus of forgotten memories and unspoken fears. Outside the office, the museum loomed vast and cavernous, its darkened halls stretching into endless night. Thomas's footsteps echoed hollowly as he wandered aimlessly, caught between the corridors of reality and the creeping nightmare the portraits had become. His mind fractured, slipping like sand through trembling fingers, each fragment a distorted recollection of a past he struggled to grasp. It was Elena Marsh who found him first, a beacon of steadiness amid the encroaching chaos. She approached quietly, her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, eyes soft but resolute. "Thomas," she said gently, reaching out to steady his staggering form beneath the flickering gallery lights. "You need to come back."
This isn't you.
He looked at her, fear and confusion mingling in his pale eyes. "They were watching," he whispered, voice cracking. "The faces, they were not just paintings anymore. They know me. They remember." Elena's brow furrowed, but she took his hand, grounding him with a touch that was both firm and kind. "We'll all figure this out together. But you have to fight it. Don't let them take you." Back in the galleries, the portraits writhed with grotesque energy. Faces twisted into macabre parodies of life, friends and family contorted by pain and betrayal. Thomas recoiled, heart pounding as the air thickened with the malevolent presence that had claimed the museum as its domain. His reflection fractured in the glass of a nearby frame, multiple distorted versions of himself staring back, fractured and lost. In a fleeting moment of clarity, Thomas and Elena found themselves seated amidst the stillness, the only sounds the distant hum of the night and their quiet breaths. Shadows stretched long across the marble floors, the silence a fragile veil over the turmoil within. They whispered of rituals and histories, of sacrifices and the thin line between memory and madness. But as the night deepened, so did the darkness within Thomas. The corrupting presence tightened its grasp, its whispers promising oblivion, its shadows threatening to swallow him whole. Elena's steady hand was his last anchor of fragile hope in a world unraveling at the seams. Outside, the portraits waited, their faces shifting subtly when no one was looking, a silent chorus of lost identities and haunted memories. And Thomas, caught between worlds, faced a descent from which there might be no return. The night stretched on endless and unforgiving, as the museum held its breath and its secrets. The candle flickered uncertainly in the stale air of the museum archives, its weak light casting long, twitching shadows across the cracked pages of the journal Thomas Aldridge had unearthed. He sat hunched over the ancient tome, the brittle paper whispering secrets of a time long buried beneath layers of dust and silence. His fingers trembled slightly as he traced the faded ink, the words revealing fragments of a history intertwined with the very walls of the museum. The journal spoke of an entity older than memory, a presence that had seeped into the collection over centuries, drawn by the emotions and lives captured in the painted faces. It was a parasite of sorts, a shadow that fed on the fears and forgotten identities of those immortalized in pigment and canvas. Thomas's heart pounded as he absorbed the implications. The shifting faces, the creeping dread he felt nightly, were not mere hallucinations but manifestations of this malevolent force. A sudden coldness brushed against his skin, a breath of wind where no door was open. He looked up sharply, the silence of the archive pressing down like a shroud. Somewhere beyond the heavy velvet curtains, the portraits in the gallery whispered and quivered, their painted eyes flickering with unnatural life. The faces he had once glimpsed changing subtly now writhed with a sinister vitality, shifting from serene portraits to grotesque, distorted visages. They were no longer just images. They had become vessels for the entity's corrupt will. Thomas's mind reeled. The entity didn't simply alter appearances, it reached into the essence of those it touched, twisting memories and emotions, distorting the very identity of the people portrayed. This was why the faces morphed into figures from his own life, why the museum seemed to pulse with a dark resonance that gnawed at his sanity. He thought of Mary, his sister, whose portrait had been one of the first to betray the truth. Once a symbol of fragile innocence, her painted gaze now shimmered with a malevolence that chilled him to the bone. The entity's corruption was personal, a wound reopened and festering, feeding on his guilt and unresolved trauma. It was as if the museum itself had become a mausoleum for forgotten pain, the entity its unholy guardian. Elena's voice broke into his thoughts as she stepped quietly into the archive, the soft rustle of her footsteps a small comfort in the oppressive gloom. "Thomas, you've been holed up here for hours. What have you found?" He closed the journal with a measured breath, eyes dark with exhaustion and fear. "It's worse than I imagined. The portraits they not just changing, they're alive with something ancient and corrupt. This presence feeds on our memories, our identities. It's the reason behind the shifts, the distortions. It's been here for centuries, trapped in the museum's collection, growing stronger with every soul it consumes." Elena's face tightened, concern knitting her brow. "So it's not just a haunting or a trick of the light. It's a force that's alive, and it's feeding off you, on us." Thomas nodded grimly. "Exactly. And it's tied to my past, to Mary's disappearance. That portrait, her face, it's the key. The entity uses what we fear most against us. If I don't confront it, it will unravel what's left of my mind and perhaps consume me completely." The weight of the revelation sank deep into the silence between them. The museum seemed to respond, a low murmur rising from the walls, as if the entity itself acknowledged Thomas's understanding. Somewhere in the shadows, a face twisted, a silent scream caught forever in oil and canvas. Thomas's resolve hardened. This was no longer a mystery to be observed from a distance. It was a battle for his very self, a desperate fight to reclaim his memories, his identity, and the fragile line between reality and nightmare. He rose, the journal tucked under his arm, and exchanged a determined glance with Elena. "We have to stop it," he said, "before it's too late." As they moved toward the gallery, the flickering candlelight behind them cast long, shifting shadows that danced like the faces that haunted his every step. The corrupting presence waited, patient and relentless, ready to consume all that Thomas held dear. And in that waiting, the museum breathed a living tome of memories, forever caught between art and the abyss. The gallery was quiet, save for the faint hum of the old heating system, and the occasional creak of the building settling into the night. Thomas Aldridge moved slowly, his footsteps softened against the thick carpet as he approached the large portrait that had been hung in the museum's east wing. This painting, his own likeness, commissioned in a more confident time, had always been a source of quiet pride, a reminder of his dedication to the art he so loved. But tonight, it was something else entirely. His breath caught in his throat as he stared. At first, the face seemed to ripple like a disturbed pond, the features blurring and shifting imperceptibly. Then, With a suddenness that made his heart pound, the image fractured, splitting into a kaleidoscope of anguished expressions layered one over another. His eyes darted, trying to focus, but the face twisted and warped eyes gleamed with fear, lips parted in silent screams, and the skin seemed to pulse as if alive beneath the varnished surface. "It's happening again," Thomas muttered, voice barely above a whisper. His mind reeled, the oppressive atmosphere of the museum pressing inward like a tightening vise. The portraits were no longer mere paintings, they were mirrors reflecting his fractured soul. From behind him, a soft but firm voice broke through the heavy silence. "Thomas, you need to step back. This isn't good for you." He turned slowly to see Elena Marsh standing near the entrance to the gallery, her dark eyes filled with concern. "I'm trying," he confessed, rubbing his temples as if to steady his thoughts. "But these images, they're not just changing. They're re-showing me who I am, or who I'm breaking into." Elena took a cautious step forward, her practical nature a stark contrast to the surreal nightmare unfolding before them. "You re-seeing your fears," she said, voice steady. "But you are not alone. We'll figure this out, together." Thomas nodded, though the knot of dread in his chest tightened. They moved deeper into the gallery, where the portraits of others hung, friends, family, strangers, each one beginning to morph in unsettling ways. Among them was the portrait of Mary, Thomas's estranged sister, whose image had been the first to shift weeks ago. Tonight, her face was a haunting study in sorrow and distortion. The expression melted from a fragile smile to something grotesque, her features elongating, twisting into shapes that defied human anatomy. Yet just as quickly it snapped back to a mournful countenance, eyes brimming with unspoken pain. Thomas felt a cold wave of guilt wash over him, memories he had buried deep resurfacing in jagged shards. "She's trapped," he whispered. "All of us are." Elena reached out, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. "Then we have to free her, free you." But as they spoke, a subtle sound began to fill the gallery, a faint chorus of whispers, like voices caught in the walls themselves. Thomas's heart raced as the words seemed to echo inside his mind, indistinct yet laden with accusation and despair. The very air thickened, the boundary between his psyche and the haunted art dissolving. He staggered, clutching a nearby pedestal for support. "It's too much," he gasped. "I'm losing myself." "Hold on," Elena urged, steadying him. "Remember who you are. Remember the truth." But truth was no longer a solid thing in this place. It was fluid, shifting like the faces in the frames, unstable, elusive, and dangerous. Thomas's reflection in a nearby polished surface stared back at him, fractured and unfamiliar. In that moment, the museum transformed from a sanctuary of art into a labyrinth of his own fractured identity. The paintings whispered secrets, memories twisted into nightmares, and the oppressive presence that had haunted the collection tightened its grip. Thomas knew the path ahead was perilous. To reclaim himself, he would have to confront the darkness within and survive the corrosive power that sought to consume not just the museum, but his very soul. And somewhere in the depths of those shifting faces, the question lingered, was there still a part of Thomas Aldridge that remained untouched, unbroken? Or was he already lost to the corruption that moved when no one was looking? The gallery lights flickered, casting long, wavering shadows across the walls, faces shifting once more in the frames, watching, waiting. The silent, haunted museum seemed to breathe with a life of its own, and Thomas, caught in the maelstrom of his unraveling identity, could only steel himself for the darkness yet to come. The night was far from over. Elena Marsh sat hunched over the heavy oak table in the museum's reading room, the faint glow of an antique desk lamp illuminating the scattered pages and dusty volumes before her. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and wax polish, a heady mixture that mingled uneasily with the low hum of the building settling into night. Outside, the city's distant murmur was swallowed by the stone walls, isolating the space into a pocket of quiet urgency. Thomas Aldridge stood nearby, his hands nervously clasped behind his back, eyes flickering between the worn texts and the calm determination etched on Alina's face. He had never seen her so absorbed, so unyielding in her focus. It was a stark contrast to his own increasingly frayed nerves and the creeping shadows that seemed to gather just beyond the edges of his vision. "There has to be something here," Alina murmured, tracing a delicate finger along a faded illustration of arcane symbols. "Something that can undo this?" Thomas nodded, swallowing the lump rising in his throat. "I don't know if there's a way out, but I can't give up." "Not yet." Alina closed the book with a soft thud and leaned back, rubbing the bridge of her nose. "The museum's history is darker than we imagined. These rituals, these invocations, they retied to the very foundation of the place. The portraits aren't just art. They're vessels for something ancient and malevolent." Her words, though heavy with implication, sparked a fragile thread of hope in Thomas. For weeks, he'd been consumed by the shifting faces, the haunted memories that clawed at his mind with every passing night. The creeping madness that threatened to swallow him whole. "We have to be careful," Alina continued, voice low and steady. "Whatever this presence is, it feeds on fear and forgotten pain. We confront it blindly, and it will consume us. But if we can perform the right ritual, if we can sever its hold on the portraits, maybe we can reclaim the museum." Thomas exhaled slowly, the weight on his chest easing just slightly. "Where do we start?" "Here." Alina pointed to a passage in a brittle manuscript, the ink faded but legible. "This describes a cleansing rite, one meant to purify spaces tainted by sorrow and betrayal. It's centuries old, but it's the closest thing I've found to a defense against this kind of corruption." Her voice held a steely resolve that bolstered Thomas's wavering spirit. They pored over the text together, marking passages, sketching symbols, and discussing the implications in hushed tones. The night stretched on, the museum around them alive with an eerie stillness that both comforted and unnerved. Later, as Thomas wandered the main gallery, the portraits seemed to watch him with renewed intensity. The faces, once distorted and shifting in unsettling ways, now appeared almost resigned, as if acknowledging the impending reckoning. The faint flicker of candlelight cast long shadows across the walls, and the air grew thick with an oppressive anticipation. Returning to Elena's side, Thomas felt a tentative grip on reality tighten. "Thank you," he whispered, voice cracking, "for not giving up on me." Elena offered a small, wary smile. "We in this together. Whatever happens, we face it side by side." In the depths of the museum, beneath layers of dust and forgotten history, a battle was about to begin. A fight not just for the art and the memories it held, but for the very soul of Thomas Aldridge and the fragile sanctuary they both clung to. As dawn threatened the horizon, the ritual's preparation was nearly complete. Symbols painted with trembling hands, whispered incantations memorized and rehearsed, and a fragile alliance forged in the crucible of shared fear and determination. But the corrupting presence was not idle. It stirred within the painted frames, sensing the threat, its shadowy tendrils twisting and writhing, ready to strike back with a fury that would test every ounce of their resolve. And in that still, haunted space between night and day, Thomas and Elena braced themselves for the confrontation that would decide everything. The faces in the portraits remained still for a moment longer, before shifting once again, their secrets waiting to be unraveled in the shadows of the museum's heart. The fight was just beginning. The muted hum of the fluorescent lights filled the austere office as Thomas Aldridge stepped across the threshold, a familiar knot of unease tightening in his chest. Simon Gray sat behind his polished mahogany desk, his robust frame leaning forward, fingers steepled, eyes sharp and unyielding. The museum's usual quiet seemed replaced here by an oppressive stillness, the weight of authority pressing down on Thomas like a physical force. "Thomas," Simon began, his voice low but firm, "this obsession of yours with the portraits, it's becoming a liability. The board is asking questions. We cannot have the museum's reputation tarnished by unfounded claims or hallucinations." Thomas met Simon's gaze, the flicker of defiance mingling with exhaustion in his pale eyes. "Simon, these changes, they are real. I've seen faces shift, memories surface in the portraits. There's something deeply wrong here." Simon's jaw tightened. "You need to stop this investigation. Now, if you continue, I will have no choice but to terminate your position. The museum needs stability, not paranoia." The ultimatum hit Thomas like a blow. He swallowed hard, the words echoing in the sterile room, the walls seeming to close in. His mind raced, his dedication to uncovering the truth clashing with the stark reality of his precarious standing. Elena Marsh stood silently in the doorway, her dark eyes filled with concern. She had sensed Thomas's growing distress and the widening gulf between him and the museum's leadership. Yet here, witnessing Simon's cold decree, her resolve only deepened. She would not let him face this alone. Thomas's hands trembled slightly as he clenched them at his sides, the portraits in his mind's eye flickering with distorted faces and shadowed memories. The creeping madness that had gnawed at his sanity now seemed to close in tighter, a noose woven from fear and isolation. Simon rose, his authoritative presence filling the room. "Think carefully, Thomas. Your choice is clear." A tense silence followed, broken only by the distant ticking of a wall clock. Thomas looked once more toward the door where Elena waited, a silent ally in the encroaching darkness. "I understand," Thomas said quietly, voice steadier than he felt. "But I can't turn away from this. Not now." Simon's eyes narrowed, a shadow of warning passing over his features. "Then you leave me no choice." As Thomas left the office, the museum's corridors stretched before him like a labyrinth of shadows and whispered fears. The portraits lining the walls seemed to watch, their faces twisting subtly in the dim light, reflecting the fracture spreading within Thomas himself. Outside the office, Elena stepped forward, her voice a quiet anchor. "We'll find a way through this, Thomas. Together." He nodded, grateful yet burdened, knowing that the path ahead would only grow darker. The ultimatum had not silenced his quest, it had sharpened it. The museum, once a sanctuary of art and memory, was now a battleground of wills and unseen forces. And Thomas Aldridge stood at its heart, caught between the crushing weight of authority and the haunting pull of a truth that threatened to unravel his very identity. As the shadows lengthened and the portraits continued their subtle, sinister movements, Thomas felt the creeping dread settle deeper. The struggle for control was far from over, and the face he would wear by the end of it remained an uncertain, shifting mask. The night awaited, thick with unspoken terrors and the promise of revelations yet to come. And Thomas, despite the ultimatum, would not back down. The heavy silence of the museum weighed on Thomas Aldridge as he wandered through the shadowed halls, the muted glow of the gallery lights casting long, flickering shadows across the polished floors. His footsteps echoed softly, a rhythm that seemed to pulse unnaturally in the stillness. Tonight, the portraits did not merely shift. They called to him with a weight he could no longer ignore. Faces he thought he knew blurred and reformed, their eyes flickering with unspoken secrets. He paused before a grand portrait of a woman whose eyes held the melancholy of a forgotten sorrow. The face was familiar, it was Mary, his sister, as she had been years ago. Thomas reached out instinctively, but the glass was cold and unyielding. The image rippled, distorting as if the canvas itself breathed. A whispered voice, barely audible, stirred in the periphery of his mind, a fragment of memory that refused to settle. The edges of reality began to fray. Thomas's breath caught as a flash of a long-buried moment surged unbidden, a childhood scene, sunlight filtering through an old window, laughter turning to silence, Mary's face twisted in pain. The memory warped, the colors bleeding into shadows that crept along the walls of his mind. He stumbled back, clutching his head as the museum around him seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The portrait's eyes followed him, their expressions shifting from sorrow to accusation. The boundary between past and present blurred, each step through the galleries a descent deeper into a nightmare where time folded upon itself. In the distance, a soft, concerned voice broke through the haze. Thomas, Elena's presence was a tether to reality, her steady gaze cutting through the turmoil. She found him trembling against a cold stone wall, his face pale and eyes wild. You need to breathe. These memories, they were not all yours to bear alone. He looked at her, desperation and fear mingling in his eyes. It's not just memory, Elena. It's like the museum itself is seeping into my mind. The past, the portraits, they all tangled together, and I don't know what's real anymore. Elena nodded, her hand firm on his shoulder. We'll find a way through this, but you have to hold on. As they moved through the corridors, the air thickened with an oppressive weight. Reflections in the glass warped grotesquely, faces melting and reforming in impossible ways. Thomas's footsteps faltered. The walls seemed to close in, the museum twisting into a labyrinth of fear and forgotten pain. Every portrait was a mirror to his fractured soul, every shadow a whisper of loss. His mind a battleground, Thomas struggled to reclaim his identity from the encroaching darkness. The memories of his sister, the haunting legacy of the museum, and the relentless presence behind the art threatened to consume him. Yet in the midst of the chaos, a fragile hope flickered, Elena's unwavering resolve and the faint possibility of redemption. As the night deepened, Thomas faced the shattering truth. The past was not simply a memory to be recalled, but a living force that could drown him if he let go. His journey through the haunted corridors was only beginning, and the faces in the frames whispered that the worst was yet to come. The room was cloaked in shadow, save for the flickering candle flames that cast dancing shapes across the cracked, leather-bound journal and scattered parchment. Elena Marsh sat cross-legged on the cold stone floor, her brow furrowed as she traced ancient symbols with a trembling finger. The musty scent of old paper mingled with the faint metallic tang of the museum's aged walls, wrapping the space in a fragile veil of history and dread. Thomas Aldridge stood nearby, his hands clenched at his sides, eyes fixed on the ritual circle Elena had painstakingly sketched in chalk. The gallery beyond remained silent, the portraits observing in muted stillness, their faces frozen yet somehow expectant. The weight of the coming confrontation pressed down on him, a suffocating presence heavier than any corporeal force. Are you certain this will work? Thomas' voice was barely above a whisper, strained with doubt. Elena's eyes met his, steady and resolute despite the tremor in her hands. It's the best chance we have. The journal describes the rite in detail. It's designed to sever the connection between the corrupting presence and the memories it feeds on. But it's not without risk. Thomas swallowed hard, memories swirling unbidden. The journal's pages had revealed more than just ritual instructions. They had peeled back layers of his own past, exposing wounds he had long buried. His sister Mary's vanished smile, the fractured family dinners. The silence that followed the unspoken tragedy, all now entwined with the dark history of the museum, and the malevolent force that twisted its art. The cost, he murmured. What exactly are we sacrificing? Elena hesitated, then spoke with a gravity that chilled the air. The ritual demands a piece of what binds you to these memories, a fragment of your identity. It's how the presence has held its grip by tethering itself to your pain and guilt. To break free, you must give it up. Thomas felt the room tilt, the candle flames flickering wildly as if responding to the words. The idea of losing a part of himself, the very essence of his being, was unbearable. Yet the alternative was surrendering entirely to the creeping madness that had begun to consume him. Preparation took hours. Elena carefully arranged talismans, candles, and relics from the museum's archives, each imbued with symbolic meaning to counteract the corrupting influence. Thomas moved through the gallery, placing his hands on the frames of the most affected portraits, Mary's among them, feeling the faint pulse of distorted memories seeping through the painted surfaces. As darkness deepened outside, the museum became a crucible of tension. An oppressive silence reigned, broken only by the slow drip of water echoing from the gallery's hidden corners. Thomas's breath came shallow, anxiety coiling in his stomach as he took his place within the ritual circle. Elena began the incantation, her voice steady but low, weaving words from the ancient text into the heavy night air. The candle flames stretched higher, shadows twisting like living things across the walls. The portraits seemed to shimmer, their faces shifting subtly, revealing glimpses of anguish, rage, and sorrow that Thomas had never seen or perhaps had refused to see before. Suddenly, a chill swept through the room, causing Thomas to shiver despite the heat of the candles. The air thickened, and spectral faces flickered on the walls, twisted reflections of those trapped within the art. His heart pounded as memories surged forward, Mary's laughter, the silence after her disappearance, the guilt that had never ebbed. The darkness pressed closer, threatening to engulf him. "Hold on, Thomas," Elena urged, her hand briefly touching his arm. "You must not falter now." Summoning every ounce of will, Thomas focused on the ritual's purpose to reclaim what the corrupting presence sought to consume. As Elena's voice rose in a final crescendo, the oppressive weight seemed to lift, the spectral faces dissolving like mist before the dawn. But the victory was not without cost. Thomas staggered, breath ragged, his eyes reflecting a profound weariness. The fragments of his past he had offered in sacrifice left him hollow in places, a man altered irrevocably. The museum felt different, as if it had exhaled after holding its breath for centuries. Elena helped him to a nearby bench, her expression a mixture of relief and concern. "You did it, Thomas. But you look spent." He nodded slowly, the shadows in his gaze deepening. "Some part of me is gone, Elena. I don't know if I can ever be whole again." Outside, the first pale light of dawn crept through the stained glass windows, casting fractured colors onto the marble floor. The portraits hung quietly, their faces still but beneath the surface. A faint pulse remained, a whisper of movement when no one was looking, reminding Thomas that the battle was won, but the war for his identity and the museum's soul was far from over. And as the museum awoke to a new day, Thomas Aldridge sat in the quiet aftermath, wrestling with the price paid and the uncertain path ahead. The air in the museum thickened, as though the very atmosphere had been soaked in ancient shadows. Thomas Aldridge stood before the grand portrait that dominated the gallery's far wall, a masterpiece whose frame was etched with serpentine carvings, darkened by age. Elena Marsh's voice rose softly into the stillness, chanting words that seemed to curl and twist in the air like smoke. The flickering overhead lights cast uneasy shadows that danced along the walls, and Thomas felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. His breath came shallow and quick, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The faces in the frames surrounding them began to writhe, subtle at first, just a twitch of a mouth, a faint narrowing of a gaze, then with growing violence. The painted eyes shifted direction, following his every movement with malevolent intent. Mouths twisted into cruel smirks and anguished screams, frozen in impossible expressions that defied the stillness of their medium. The museum seemed to exhale a cold, choking fog that slithered around their ankles and crept up their limbs. Thomas's knees trembled, but he forced himself to stand firm. "Elena," he whispered, voice cracking with a mixture of fear and resolve, "what is happening?" She paused her incantation briefly, her dark eyes meeting his. "The boundary is breaking, Thomas. The entity's grip loosens only when we draw it into the open, into this ritual. But it will fight back. Hard." Suddenly, the edges of the room blurred and dissolved like ink dropped into water. The solid marble floors faded into swirling shadows. The ornate walls melted into a kaleidoscope of twisted memories and fractured images. Thomas staggered back, clutching the edge of a nearby pedestal, struggling to anchor himself. Around him, the portraits transformed into living phantasms. Faces of people he once loved and feared contorted with grotesque malice. His sister Mary's visage flickered before him, morphing rapidly from the innocent child he remembered to a snarling specter of accusation and pain. A chorus of whispered voices rose, murmuring forgotten sins and half-remembered regrets that clawed at the edges of his mind.
Stay with me, Thomas!
Elena's voice cut through the cows. She reached out, gripping his arm tightly as if to tether him to the fragile thread of reality. Remember who you are. Remember what is true. Thomas closed his eyes, teeth clenched against the storm of emotions and images battering his consciousness. He grasped for the clarity buried beneath the nightmare, the truth that lay beyond the corrupting presence's lies. His mind flickered to the journal they had found, the ancient words inscribed by someone who had battled this darkness before. "I won't let you take me," he muttered fiercely, "not again." Opening his eyes, he saw Elena standing firm, her face pale but resolute. Together, they faced the swirling shadow that coalesced at the center of the nightmare, a shifting mass of dark tendrils and fractured faces, an ancient presence feeding on fear and fragmented identity. The entity's voice slithered into their minds, a cacophony of despair and temptation. "Surrender your memories," it hissed. "Give yourself to the void. Become part of the endless gallery." Thomas shook his head, despite the dizzying pull, despite the screams echoing from the portraits. "I am not yours. I am more than the sum of my memories." Elena stepped forward, chanting again with renewed strength. The shadows shrieked and recoiled as a brilliant light burst forth from the ritual circle they had drawn. The nightmare trembled, fracturing like glass under pressure. But the fight was far from over. Thomas felt a sharp, searing pain in his chest, the entity's desperate grasp threatening to tear his psyche apart. Clinging to Elena's presence, he summoned every fragment of his will, every shard of truth he could grasp. This was his battle, his nightmare to endure and overcome. As the nightmare realm writhed and twisted around them, Thomas's resolve hardened. He would not be consumed. He would reclaim the faces that haunted him, the memories that defined him, and confront the darkness that sought to erase his very self. The museum, the portraits, the shadows, all were caught in a violent dance of light and darkness. And Thomas Aldridge stood at the heart of it, the tenuous line between madness and salvation. The air in the museum had grown thick, oppressive not merely with dust or the scent of aged oil paint, but with something far more sinister. Thomas Aldridge's footsteps echoed unevenly along the warped floorboards, each step a tremor in a reality that seemed to buckle and twist around him. The portraits lining the hallways were no longer passive observers. Their faces convulsed, shifting grotesquely, as though alive and breathing in the dim light. Eyes met his with a predatory gleam, jaws slightly parted in silent snarls, and expressions contorted into twisted mockeries of human emotion. Thomas clenched his fists, the fabric of his sleeve rough against his skin, grounding him to the moment. He forced a steadying breath, though his chest heaved with dread. The museum was no longer a sanctuary, but a labyrinth of nightmare, its boundaries dissolving into a surreal realm where memories and phantoms collided. His mind trembled on the precipice of madness, assaulted by whispered voices rippling through the warped air, fragments of guilt, fear, and forgotten pain. From the shadows, a soft, familiar voice cut through the chaos. "Thomas, hold on. You're not alone." Elena Marsh stepped forward, her eyes bright with concern and determination, her presence a fragile tether to the world he desperately clung to. Her hand reached out, trembling yet resolute, brushing against his arm. The touch was a lifeline, a reminder of reality beyond the shifting faces and eldritch shadows. He met her gaze, seeing the mixture of fear and hope reflecting back at him. "I don't know how much longer I can fight this," he whispered, voice raw with exhaustion. "You have to. We both do." Elena's words were steady, a balm against the tempest swirling within him. She pulled him gently away from the nearest portrait, whose eyes had morphed into the haunted visage of his sister, Mary, twisted now with sorrow and accusation. The corrupting presence was closing in, its influence tangible, a malevolent distortion seeping from the very canvas and frame of the portraits. Suddenly, a wave of spectral faces erupted from the walls, swirling around Thomas like a maelstrom of anguish and despair. Their silent screams echoed in his mind, each expression a reflection of his fractured self-fear, regret, and a desperate yearning for redemption. Thomas staggered back, heart pounding as the spectral faces loomed closer, the air vibrating with their silent torment. The boundary between his mind and the entity's corruption blurred dangerously. For a moment, he felt himself slipping, the shadows tugging at his sanity, promising oblivion. But then, a spark, fragile yet fierce, ignited within him. He clenched his fists, the muscles taut beneath his sleeves, and forced his gaze to meet the swirling faces. "No," he breathed, voice breaking but resolute. "I am not yours." The museum around him shuddered, the distorted reality cracking like glass under the strain of his defiance. The spectral faces faltered, their anguished expressions flickering like dying embers. The oppressive weight lifted slightly, and for a fleeting moment, the familiar outlines of the gallery returned. Alina grasped his hand firmly. "Stay with me," she urged, her voice a beacon in the storm. "Fight it." Thomas nodded, swallowing hard against the torrent of fear and madness threatening to overwhelm him. The corrupting presence had not been defeated, it still lurked, insidious and patient, but he had found a fragment of strength, a resolve born from desperation and love. As the museum's warped reality trembled on the cusp of collapse, Thomas knew the battle was far from over. Yet in that fractured moment, amid the echoes of his haunted past and the shifting faces that sought to claim him, he chose to fight, clinging to the fragile thread of his identity against the encroaching darkness. Outside the gallery, the night deepened, silent but charged with the residue of the unseen struggle within. The portraits, though momentarily stilled, seemed to watch with quiet menace, their faces ready to shift again when no one was looking. Thomas's breaking point had come, but so had his defiant stand. The war for his mind and the museum's soul surged onward, relentless and unforgiving. The grand hall was a tempest of shadows and shifting faces, the air heavy with a suffocating chill that seemed to seep from the very walls themselves. Thomas Aldridge stood at the center, his breath shallow, eyes darting between the portraits that lined the room like silent sentinels. Yet tonight, those sentinels were no longer silent. They moved, twisted and convulsed with a grotesque life of their own. Faces melted into one another, skin rippling and reforming, eyes glowing with a malevolent light that pierced the dimness. It was as if the very essence of the museum was tearing itself apart, the corruption within the paintings now unleashed in full fury. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest, each thudding beat a desperate plea for sanity. The portraits were no longer mere images. They were monstrous reflections of his past, distorted by the corrupting presence that had consumed the museum. He saw friends and family twisted into nightmarish parodies, their eyes accusing, their mouths twisted in silent screams. His own reflection appeared in a self-portrait fractured, unreadable, a broken mirror of his soul.
"Thomas!"
Elena's voice rang out, sharp and steady amid the chaos. She reached for him, her hand trembling but resolute. "Hold on! Don't let it consume you. Remember who you are." The shadows slithered like living smoke, creeping from the canvases toward them, tendrils of darkness that chilled the very marrow. Elena's presence was a fragile anchor in the storm, her voice a tether pulling him back from the brink. But the corrupting presence would not relent. It sought to erase him, to dissolve his identity until nothing remained but a hollow shell. In the midst of the assault, a sudden hush fell. The hall seemed to pause. Thomas's gaze locked with the self-portrait, once more the shattered visage staring back with a haunting intensity. And in that moment, a spark ignited within him, a flicker of self-awareness that cut through the madness like a shard of light. He saw himself clearly, not as the broken reflection the entity wished to impose, but as a man still fighting, still clinging to the memories and truths buried beneath the corruption. It was a fragile clarity, a fleeting moment of lucidity, but it was enough. The museum trembled, ancient foundations groaning under the weight of the supernatural struggle. The corrupted faces in the portraits faltered, their violent contortions stilled as the malevolent force recoiled, sensing the threat of resistance. Thomas drew a ragged breath, gathering the strength that surged from the sliver of hope. "Alina," he whispered, voice hoarse but firm. "It's not over. We still have a chance." She nodded, eyes bright with determination. Together, they stood amid the eerie silence, poised on the precipice of the final confrontation. The corrupting presence might wield terrifying power, but Thomas had glimpsed the truth, a fractured self that refused to be consumed. As the portraits' faces settled into uneasy stillness, the tension in the hall was palpable. The battle for identity and reality had reached its breaking point. And in that fragile moment, the first step toward reclaiming the museum and himself was taken. But the shadows still lingered, subtle and insidious. The faces that moved, when no one was looking, were not done with him yet. The fight was far from finished, and the question remained, could Thomas hold on to his fractured self against the encroaching darkness? Or would he be swallowed whole by the corruption that haunted every brushstroke? The answer lay just beyond the trembling threshold of the museum's haunted heart. The air within the museum was thick and heavy, each breath a laborious task, as if the very atmosphere conspired to suffocate all hope. Thomas Aldridge stepped cautiously into the central gallery, his footsteps echoing against cold marble floors. Around him, the portraits, those silent sentinels, seemed alive with a sinister energy, their faces twisting and contorting in grotesque mimicry of pain and despair. The once familiar visages were now grotesque masks, shifting with a life of their own, each brushstroke pulsing with malignant intent. His heart thundered in his chest, but Thomas forced himself to steady his breathing, to push past the choking dread that sought to consume him. He was here to confront the source of the corruption, the ancient entity that had seeped into the very fabric of the museum's art and his own memories. The journal's faded pages and Elena's tireless research had prepared him for this moment. Yet nothing could have readied him for the reality of facing a force so profoundly malevolent. A sudden chill brushed against his skin, raising goosebumps despite the warmth of his coat. The shadows between the frames seemed to flicker and writhe, coalescing into a shifting mass of darkness that pulsed like a living thing. From this formless shadow, the entity manifested itself not as a singular figure but as a creeping, undulating distortion that wormed its way through the gallery walls and the painted faces alike. "You cannot escape me, Thomas," a voice whispered, disembodied yet resonant, echoing through the hollow spaces. "You are mine, as are they, your memories, your guilt, your soul." Thomas clenched his fists, voice trembling yet resolute. "No, I will not let you consume me. I am more than your darkness." Behind him, Elena's voice rose in steady incantation, the words ancient and sonorous, weaving through the charged air like a lifeline. She had insisted on standing close, her unwavering presence a beacon amid the encroaching chaos. The ritual she had uncovered in the archives was their only hope, a means to sever the malevolent force's grip on the museum and on Thomas himself. The portraits around them began to ripple violently, faces twisting into horrific parodies of those Thomas loved and lost. The image of Mary, the sister whose absence had haunted his every waking moment, emerged with startling clarity. Her painted eyes glistened with tears, haunting and accusatory. Thomas staggered forward, reaching out as if to touch the canvas, to connect with the ghost of a past he had long tried to bury. "Mari, I'm sorry," he whispered, voice breaking. "I've carried this pain too long." The entity recoiled, its dark form shuddering in the face of raw human emotion. Thomas felt the weight of years' guilt, grief, and love pouring from his core, clashing against the inescapable corruption that sought to define him. Elena's chant intensified, her hands raised toward the flickering paintings. Light began to emanate from the ritual circle they had drawn, brilliant and purifying. The shadows screamed, a soundless wail that vibrated through the walls and through Thomas's very bones. The distortion faltered, then fragmented, breaking apart like shattered glass. With a final surge, the oppressive darkness was expelled, leaving the gallery bathed in an ethereal glow. The faces on the portraits settled back into their original forms, serene yet forever marked by the ordeal. Thomas collapsed to his knees, breath ragged but free. The crushing weight of the entity lifted yet leaving deep scars upon his soul. Elena knelt beside him, her hand steadying his trembling frame. "You did it, Thomas, we did it." But even in the relief, Thomas knew the battle had changed him irrevocably. The fractured reflections of his identity might never fully mend, and the question lingered: what was real, and what was the residue of a nightmare from which he might never fully awaken? As dawn's first light filtered through the museum's stained glass, the portraits hung quietly still, their faces serene once more. Yet in the faintest moments when no one was watching, their eyes flickered with life, reminders of the darkness that once dwelled within, and perhaps still lingered, just beneath the surface. Thomas rose slowly, a hollow strength filling his frame. The final confrontation was over, but the echoes of that night would haunt the museum and his soul for years to come. He stepped forward, ready to face whatever came next, forever changed by the faces that moved when no one was looking. The air in the museum was heavy with a silence that seemed to press against Thomas Aldridge's chest as he stepped carefully through the main gallery. The confrontation, raw, violent, and harrowing, had left its mark not only on the walls and floors, but deep within the very fabric of the place. The portraits, once subtly shifting in their frames, now hung with an unnerving stillness. Yet beneath that stillness, in the depths of their painted eyes, lurked a watchfulness that unsettled even Thomas's wary mind. He paused before a towering canvas, the image of a woman rendered with exquisite detail and somber hues. The face was familiar, impossibly so. It was Mary, his sister. But the portrait's expression was frozen in a moment of tragic finality, a cruel stillness that whispered of loss and regret. Thomas's breath caught, and for a long moment he could do nothing but stare. Behind him, the faint sound of footsteps echoed softly across the marble floor. Elena Marsh approached, her dark eyes reflecting the pale light that filtered through the tall museum windows. The first hints of dawn crept in, casting long, twisting shadows that seemed to stretch and recoil with a life of their own. "Thomas," she said quietly, her voice steady but fragile, "we made it through. The worst is behind us." He turned slowly, managing a faint nod. "I don't know what we've left behind, Elena. The museum, it's changed. Everything feels fractured. Like the lines between what's real and what's memory have been blurred beyond repair." Elena stepped closer, offering a tentative smile. "Maybe. But at least we're still here." The gallery door creaked open, and Simon Gray entered, his usual robust authority tempered by a cautious wariness. His eyes swept the room, taking in the subtle distortions in the walls, the faint shimmer of something unseen lingering in the air. "I never believed in thee." He stopped, swallowing hard. "Whatever this was," he finished, voice low. "But I can't deny the change." Thomas studied Simon's face, seeing the cracks in his certainty. "It's not over," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "The force that corrupted the art is weakened, but it's still here. It's a part of this place now." Simon nodded slowly. "And us." The three stood silently, surrounded by the echoes of memories and shadows that haunted the museum's halls. Thomas's gaze returned to Mary's portrait, the weight of the past pressing down on him like a physical burden. "I don't know if I can ever be the man I was before," he whispered, "or if that man even exists anymore." Elena reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "You're still here, Thomas, and that has to count for something." Outside, the dawn brightened, promising a new day, uncertain, fragile, but real. And within the museum's transformed walls, the faces that once moved in secret now remained still, yet never truly silent. They were reminders of the corruption that had passed through, the memories that refused to fade, and the enduring struggle to reclaim identity in a world forever altered. As Thomas turned away, the faintest flicker in the corner of his vision caught his attention, a subtle shift in a distant portrait's eyes, a whisper of movement when no one was looking, a reminder that the shadows of the past might never fully release their hold, and the faces that remained carried stories still waiting to be told. The silence deepened, heavy and complete, but beneath it, a pulse faint, persistent beat on. Thomas took a slow, steadying breath. The journey was far from over. Yet in this moment of fragile peace, he was alive. The museum lay in a hush that felt less like peace and more like the calm before a storm that had already passed, but had left its shadow behind. Thomas Aldridge stood near the entrance of the main gallery, his gaze fixed on the rows of portraits lining the walls. The dim light from the high windows cast long, wavering shadows, and the silence was broken only by the faint, almost imperceptible shifts of the painted faces. They moved just barely, an unsettling twitch of an eye, a subtle curl of a lip, a glance that flickered with strange intelligence. Thomas's breath hitched as he watched a familiar face, once that of a distant relative, now contorted in a way that seemed both sorrowful and mocking. The echoes of the ordeal that had gripped the museum lingered like a thick fog, though the corrupting presence had been challenged, and for a moment seemed to have receded. The portraits remained alive with a restless energy. It was as if the memories and identities trapped within them refused to be silent, refusing to be confined. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Elena Marsh stepping quietly into the gallery. Her expression was one of careful concern, tempered by the pragmatism that had always been her anchor amid Thomas's spiraling fears. "You've been here a while," she said softly, her voice the only sound besides the whisper of his own breathing. Thomas nodded, rubbing his temples. "I can't seem to tear my eyes away. They're still moving, even now." Elena stepped closer, her eyes scanning the shifting faces. "Maybe it's not about stopping them. Maybe it's about understanding what they've become." He looked at her, the weight of his fractured self pressing down. "I don't know if I can ever undo what's been done. The corruption, it's left a mark on all of us, on the museum itself, and on me." Outside the gallery, Simon Gray's heavy footsteps echoed as he made his way through the halls. His earlier dismissiveness had turned to a wary vigilance, though he still refused to voice outright belief in the supernatural. Yet even he could not deny the unease that clung to the walls. Simon paused before a particularly ancient portrait, a nobleman whose painted eyes seemed to flicker with a life of their own. He frowned, feeling a cold shiver crawl up his spine. "It's just the light," he muttered to himself, though the words felt hollow. When the museum finally closed for the night, Thomas lingered by the heavy oak doors, his hand resting on the cold brass handle. The gallery was dark now, save for the moonlight filtering through the stained glass, casting eerie colors upon the floor. He took a final glance back at the portraits. One face twitched a small, almost imperceptible smile before settling back into its painted stillness. A shiver ran down Thomas's spine. The faces that moved when no one was looking were still watching, still waiting. In the silence, Thomas found no answers, only questions. Was the corruption truly defeated, or had it simply woven itself into the fabric of the museum and his own identity? Could he ever reclaim the parts of himself lost to those haunted memories? Or was he forever bound to the shifting faces that whispered of lost identities and buried sins? As he locked the door behind him, the weight of the past pressed close, a presence as real as the night itself. The faces remained, and with them, the uneasy dread that no amount of light could fully dispel. And so the museum waited, a silent witness to the fragile boundary between reality and nightmare, where art and memory intertwined in an eternal dance of shadows and whispers.